She broke down on camera, but was a single tear actually real? The question absolutely refuses to go away. Is Meghan Markle a deeply misunderstood woman navigating impossible and relentless public pressure, or is she the most calculated image architect operating in modern celebrity culture today? Because right now, following her latest emotional podcast appearance, that debate has exploded louder and more intensely than it ever has before. The episode leaned heavily into vulnerability, tears, raw feelings, deeply personal confessions, and while some viewers felt genuine compassion watching it unfold, a significant portion of the audience argued it only threw more fuel onto an already raging fire of criticism that has been burning around her for years. "I don't know how much longer my father has. He won't speak to me because of the security situation. I would love nothing more than reconciliation with my family. There's really no point in continuing to fight anymore. Life is precious." But here's the problem with that statement. If reconciliation is truly the goal, if repairing those broken family bonds is the genuine intention, then going on a public platform to once again assign blame seems like the single worst possible strategy imaginable. That's not bridge building, that's broadcasting the wreckage live for the entire world to watch and pick apart. Then there was the unmistakable dynamic between Meghan and podcast host Jamie Kern-Lima. The energy in the room made viewers visibly uncomfortable from the very first moments. It felt less like a real interview and more like an extended admiration ceremony, with compliments and validation flowing freely in every direction while genuinely tough questions remained nowhere in sight. Social media picked up on it almost instantly. The memes, the running commentary, the eye rolls were immediate and relentless. But that was only the opening act of what turned into a much bigger story. The controversy deepened significantly when Meghan landed on Time magazine's list of the 100 most influential women. Critics came out swinging without hesitation, loudly questioning whether the recognition was truly earned on merit or simply handed to her based on name recognition and royal association. The timing made everything considerably worse. Just days after the list dropped, Prince Harry's BBC interview aired, generating its own separate wave of deeply uncomfortable moments that had audiences shifting uneasily and public perception teetering right on the edge. Behind the carefully polished image Meghan consistently presents to the public, whispers from former staff members began resurfacing and finding new audiences. These accounts painted a picture of someone demanding, exacting, and intensely self-focused. They weren't entirely new allegations, but they found fresh oxygen in the current media climate. Combined with a series of high-profile business disappointments, Spotify walking away from their deal, Netflix projects significantly under-delivering against expectations, the perception of a carefully calculated operator rather than a genuinely relatable human being only continued to grow stronger and more entrenched. There's a fundamental and almost irresolvable tension sitting right at the core of her story. She was an actress who became a real princess, then walked away from all of it, and now appears to want the very best of both worlds simultaneously, the warmth and relatability of an everyday person alongside the status and authority of royalty, without fully committing to either side of that equation. Some voices online even began suggesting she should stop signing personal correspondence and gifts as Her Royal Highness. Whether that criticism is fair or not, the conversation keeps getting notably louder with each and every public appearance she makes. The podcast itself was promoted as something stripped back and completely unfiltered. No makeup, no script, just Meghan speaking her unvarnished truth directly to listeners. But a very significant portion of the audience simply wasn't convinced by that framing. To skeptics, the entire episode felt meticulously staged and carefully produced, far more polished performance than genuine candid conversation, and the repeated reassurances throughout that Meghan hadn't seen the interview questions in advance actually backfired quite spectacularly. Rather than establishing credibility and trust with the audience, it raised considerably more suspicion than it resolved. If that was simply an organic, natural truth, why would it need to be highlighted and emphasized so many times throughout a single episode? Alexander Ralliman of the Daily Mail publicly dismissed her emotional moments as carefully timed and strategically placed attempts to remain culturally relevant in an increasingly crowded media landscape. Over on X, one particularly sharp user quipped that even her tears have their own dedicated PR team, a brutal observation, but one that clearly resonated widely enough to spread across platforms. Critics also repeatedly pointed out that virtually every story shared during the episode circled back to Meghan herself, her personal hardships, her business ventures, her unique perspective on every situation, making the whole experience feel far more like an extended personal promotional tour than any kind of genuine open-hearted conversation. Her product launch sold out in just 30 minutes, which sounds genuinely remarkable on the surface and generated significant positive headlines. But when you factor in that stock levels may have been deliberately kept artificially low from the very beginning, it starts looking considerably less like organic consumer demand and far more like a textbook manufactured scarcity play. Engineer urgency, generate maximum buzz, and make what is ultimately a modest launch appear to be an unstoppable commercial triumph that validates everything she's building. She also opened up about motherhood during the episode, sharing that she writes nightly emails to her 2 young children as a form of connection and self-care. Genuinely sweet, undeniably so. But more than a few observers found it almost too perfectly constructed, like something lifted carefully and deliberately from a premium lifestyle brand's content calendar, rather than an unguarded glimpse into real family life. Meanwhile, the episode itself racked up enormous streaming numbers across platforms, and clips spread rapidly to every corner of social media. Jamie described the whole thing as raw and completely unfiltered, but the relentless, almost exhausting emphasis on authenticity had the precise opposite effect on many viewers, because the harder someone visibly works to prove they're being genuine and spontaneous, the more people begin to question why so much convincing seems necessary in the first place. The repeated insistence that nothing was pre-planned or rehearsed actually amplified doubt rather than dissolving it. For a substantial portion of the audience, it felt less like credible proof of real spontaneity and considerably more like a coordinated effort to sell a narrative that viewers weren't entirely ready or willing to purchase at full price. One person online joked bluntly that even her tears arrive with a full production team behind them, mocking what they saw as an overproduced and emotionally calculated delivery while questioning the basic sincerity behind every visible emotion. Meanwhile, critics consistently noted that Meghan's personal stories kept looping back around to herself, her struggles, her ventures, her perspective on everything, which made the interview register more as personal promotion than genuine honest reflection with any real substance behind it. Her appearance at the Time 100 summit triggered yet another distinct and pointed wave of sharp online commentary. Viewers openly debated who came across as more performative in their public appearances, Meghan Markle or Blake Lively. Even without actually making the 2025 list itself, her mere presence within that orbit and conversation was more than enough to reignite a fresh wave of backlash from critics who had been waiting for the next opening. People called the attention surrounding her wildly disproportionate to her actual documented impact. Selling jam, honey, and cupcake sprinkles doesn't exactly scream global influence, one commenter wrote bluntly and with obvious frustration. Who does she think she is? Gayle King is someone actually changing the game. That particular comparison landed with a sting that many observers noted. GB News highlighted critics consistently framing her as someone who benefits enormously from royal associations, while her genuine, independently earned cultural impact remains perpetually thin and bitterly disputed. For a growing number of observers, the Time recognition began feeling less like a prestigious and meaningful honor and increasingly like a fundamental institutional confusion about what the word influence actually means and requires in practice. And just when the drama appeared to be settling into a manageable simmer, Prince Harry's BBC interview turned the temperature all the way back up again. His very public criticism of King Charles over personal security matters, coming directly after losing a significant court appeal on the same issue, triggered a massive and immediate media storm, but not remotely the sympathetic one he may have been hoping to generate. Columnist Sarah Vine called his tone unmistakably self-pitying and accused him directly of leveraging his own father's serious illness purely for public sympathy and continued narrative control. Palace insiders reportedly told multiple outlets that the timing and overall delivery of Harry's pointed comments showed a profound lack of judgment given the extraordinary sensitivity of the broader family situation at this particular moment. The Mirror even reported that King Charles has since grown deeply and understandably cautious about any private conversations, now worried that virtually anything said in confidence could become raw material for the next carefully timed interview or Netflix documentary. Social media reactions were swift and merciless, with users broadly labeling Harry entitled and describing the entire episode as another calculated grievance performance rather than a genuine human moment. And behind the scenes, the business picture continued raising its own uncomfortable questions. Rebranding attempts and new product launches were happening at a pace that left seasoned industry observers genuinely wondering whether any coherent long-term strategic vision existed, or whether the approach was simply reactive, responding to mounting public pressure and shifting headlines rather than building deliberately towards something meaningful and lasting. One particularly pointed critic summarized it cleanly. It genuinely feels like they're throwing absolutely everything at the wall and just waiting to see what manages to stick. As sustained attention shifted toward their overall media strategy, a broader and increasingly important debate emerged about whether the couple's relentless schedule of high-profile interviews, carefully timed public statements, was actually helping or actively damaging their long-term reputation and credibility. Some experienced analysts argue that these frequent emotional appearances keep controversies artificially alive, preventing them from fading naturally the way they otherwise would. Others maintain firmly that speaking out publicly and consistently remains the only realistic way the couple can retain any meaningful control over their own narrative in a media environment that would otherwise define them entirely without their input. Media personalities across the board have not held back even slightly in offering their sharp and often harsh opinions on everything unfolding. Megyn Kelly publicly labeled Meghan a malignant narcissist, a description that sent genuine shockwaves rippling through talk shows and social media feeds for days afterward. Celia Walden of The Telegraph described the podcast as something closer to a self-focused therapy session than any kind of meaningful interview, framing the entire production as an elaborate exercise in personal promotion, wearing the costume of honest conversation. Page 6 added considerable additional fuel to the fire by reporting that prominent wellness brands, including Goop, allegedly chose not to pursue any collaboration with Meghan whatsoever, viewing her as simply too polarizing and commercially risky for their carefully cultivated audience and brand identity. That specific claim alone sparked an entirely separate wave of outrage and intense curiosity across social platforms, with users passionately debating whether those kinds of business decisions represent smart reputation management or straightforward commercial caution from companies protecting their bottom line. Critics argue consistently and with conviction that every single time Meghan becomes visibly emotional or shares something apparently personal and intimate, it feels less and less like authentic human vulnerability and more like a precisely calibrated effort to shift public perception in a specific and predetermined direction. Emotional moments that once struck genuine chords with large audiences now reliably invite skepticism because people have learned to question the underlying intention before they allow themselves to simply feel the feeling being presented to them. Attention then turned sharply toward podcast host Jamie Kern-Lima herself, who found herself under a level of public scrutiny she clearly hadn't anticipated. Viewers widely said her energy throughout the episode felt rehearsed and oddly artificial, as though she were faithfully following a carefully written script overflowing with validation and praise, rather than exercising any independent journalistic curiosity. YouTube commentator The Royal Rogue described her overall tone as high-pitched and deeply unnatural, suggesting she came across more like a hired professional cheerleader than any kind of genuinely independent interviewer with her own perspective and agenda. Rose Lanigan echoed the sentiment precisely, arguing that Jamie's relentless enthusiasm and constant gushing effectively transformed what should have been a substantive episode into something resembling a late-night infomercial for a product nobody had quite asked for. Over on X, users piled on enthusiastically, collectively calling the entire production a full-scale Meghan hype operation from beginning to end. The genuine irony that made this particular critique sting was impossible to ignore. Jamie Kern-Lima is absolutely not an ordinary host or an inexperienced figure in business. She built her own company from scratch and sold it for $1 billion, demonstrating a level of commercial understanding and strategic intelligence that operates at the very highest tier. That remarkable background is precisely why so many listeners were left genuinely puzzled by what they witnessed. Rather than bringing sharp strategic insight or even mildly probing questions to the conversation, she spent the entire episode enthusiastically amplifying Meghan's existing message without challenge or meaningful pushback. The consensus online coalesced quickly and clearly around one central conclusion. The episode appeared tightly controlled and meticulously pre-planned, prioritizing brand image above everything, including authenticity. The obvious question that emerged from that observation was a good one. Why would someone of her proven business sophistication willingly transform her own established platform into what amounted to a polished PR showcase? The optics pointed unmistakably toward careful advance planning, and audiences who noticed weren't willing to simply let it go. Supporters, for their part, remained genuinely and passionately loyal in the face of all of it. They point out, with some real legitimacy behind the argument, that women operating in the public eye consistently face substantially harsher, more personal, and more sustained criticism than their male counterparts ever encounter, doing comparable things in comparable spaces. They argue further that the narratives constructed around Meghan have frequently been distorted, exaggerated, or built on bad faith foundations from the very beginning of her public life as a royal. From that perspective, she is simply a woman working to carve out a new and viable identity beyond the rigid constraints of royal life, a genuinely difficult transition that would challenge almost anyone, let alone someone navigating it under an unrelenting global microscope with no real precedent to follow. Critics, however, see a recurring pattern that has become too consistent and too conveniently timed to dismiss as coincidence. Emotional storytelling appearing closely and reliably followed by a product launch, a business announcement, or a fresh brand initiative. That rhythm, regardless of whether it's consciously designed that way, breeds a kind of deep and lasting suspicion that doesn't dissolve easily. It makes even the most apparently heartfelt and sincere moments feel like strategic setup rather than spontaneous human emotion, and that perception, once it takes root, is extraordinarily difficult to uproot. Media analysts are now raising a genuinely important and strategically relevant question about what lies ahead. Can Meghan and Harry realistically sustain this level of intense and emotionally charged public exposure over the long term without eventually triggering serious and potentially permanent audience fatigue? Some experienced experts warn clearly that continuous high-frequency exposure leads audiences to gradually withdraw their emotional investment. The more relentless and emotionally loaded the appearances become, the less sympathy audiences are able to genuinely feel, and creeping doubt slowly but surely moves in to replace whatever trust once existed. Others make the opposite argument with equal conviction, that controversy reliably keeps them in the active public conversation, and in today's hyper-fragmented media landscape, sustained attention still translates meaningfully into cultural influence, whether critics like it or not. Pressure is unquestionably building around whatever their next major moves turn out to be. After the notably mixed reactions that greeted previous projects and announcements, expectations have shifted dramatically. Industry insiders are reportedly watching every development with close attention, with one executive pointedly noting that whatever comes next must deliver something with real, tangible, demonstrable value, rather than simply generating another cycle of breathless headlines followed by sharp disappointment. Results are going to matter considerably more than buzz this time around, and credibility will ultimately be measured in actual output and genuine impact, rather than in media hype and carefully manufactured moments of apparent triumph. What remains undeniably clear through everything is that public opinion on Meghan Markle sits at a genuine and consequential crossroads, a volatile, constantly shifting combination of fierce admiration, deep and persistent skepticism, and in some corners outright contempt. Every interview, every podcast episode, every product launch, every emotional moment captured on camera becomes another chapter in a much larger ongoing story, one watched, relentlessly dissected, and firmly judged by tens of millions of people simultaneously across every platform and time zone. The line between authentic human vulnerability and deliberate, carefully managed performance has perhaps never been harder to locate with any real confidence. And through absolutely all of it, one central question keeps returning, with the same insistence: are we watching two real people finally telling their genuine truth to anyone willing to listen? Or are we witnessing a remarkably sophisticated masterclass in personal branding, wrapped expertly in the language and imagery of raw, unfiltered emotion? The cameras keep rolling without pause, the audience keeps watching without looking away, and the debate for now shows absolutely no signs of cooling down anytime soon. Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below, and if this gave you any kind of new angle or perspective on the story, share it with someone who has been following it just as closely as you have.